Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. I am just hoping that everybody comes in and we're going to kick off for the Scott Thornbury extravaganza. It's our annual event. We're extremely proud of it. We're extremely proud of him. The best way we can introduce him, obviously, is by asking one of his students. So Chris Collins, one of the MATEFL graduates, is going to introduce Scott.
All right, hello, everybody can hear me? Great. So my name is Christopher Collins, and I teach in the American Language program at Columbia University. As a former student of Scott Thornbury in the MATEFL program, I'd like to say a few things about why so many of his students admire him and continue to admire him after they finish the program. First, in his classes, Scott is impressively knowledgeable about both language and language teaching. He gave us students a variety of tasks, lengthy, time-consuming tasks, that enabled us to truly understand the concepts it was important to know and understand in our development as English language teachers. I find it striking that even years later, I refer to materials from Scott's classes for guidance when approaching certain areas of teaching. Secondly, the way Scott interacts with students serves as a model for how many of us could interact with our own students. Knowledgeable, motivating, respectful, and there to help us achieve our goals. At some point in one of my classes, Scott introduced us to the idea that we might be a guide on the side rather than a sage on the stage. And that bit of wisdom has proven to be essential to how I have approached my own role in the classroom ever since. Finally, Scott's presence on the internet, whether on social media or through his blog posts, has allowed us to continue to interact with him and stay aware of his interests in language teaching. Events like tonight's, which demonstrate Scott's ongoing and passionate commitment to the field, are one of the many aspects of his professionalism that students appreciate about Scott. Thank you. And Scott.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christopher. That's one of the wonderful things about, well, this event, but also the 2 months that I spend in New York in the summer is touching base with all my ex-students, alumni, I think you call them here. Just do a show of hands, actually. How many MATEFL students are there in the audience? Yeah, I mean, this is amazing, absolutely amazing, because every year it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's got to the point, it's got beyond critical mass, and I stopped remembering your names, and I'm so ashamed. Christopher comes from that early cohort of students who I met. I met Christopher after I'd taught him. No, I mean, we didn't meet until after the course had finished, or in Japan. Yeah. But this is, again, one of the gratifying things about working on this program, that you work with people very intensively over the program online, but you never meet them until some considerable time afterwards. And, or vice versa. You work intensively with people here on site during the summer, and then people kind of disappear, and then you bang into them in some conference in Korea, or Santiago de Compostela, or Santiago de Chile, or wherever. Anyway, it's lovely to be here on this, in this wonderful venue. The last person who stood on this stage of any fame was Hillary Clinton. She was here about 2 weeks ago. She was, yes, she was heckled. She was heckled. I'm hoping I don't have the same experience. What I'm going to do, what I want to talk through, it's kind of, this was originally a kind of an idea, and I'll tell you a little bit about the germ of it as we go along. It's a little bit sort of offbeat in the sense it's not really a whole lot to do with English as a second language teaching, but I'll try and draw the connections as I go along. But it's a kind of interest, an ongoing interest of mine, and I think I want to share it with you, and it's up to you to decide really how relevant it is to our field. It's sort of work in progress, if you like. Well, it was when I first started investigating this area about 4 years ago. But it continues to be work in progress, not just for me, but for a lot of people involved in education, cognitive science, and linguistics, etc. So going back to this guy, who is it? Descartes, exactly, René Descartes. And what is he famous for having said? If nobody knows anything about Descartes, they know that. And of course, it was Descartes who was the instrumental in making that big distinction in philosophy, in Western philosophy at least, between the mind and the body. He was the kind of one who kind of raised it down the middle and made this great separation between the mind and the body. And mind was the rational thing that did this thinking and gave us our sense of our own identity, etc. It's what we operated with. It was very separate from the body, and the body had nothing to do with it. It was this kind of distinction. The mind plus the body equaled the full human being, but there's a separation between the mind and the body. Now, what people have been looking at recently, both in philosophy, but also in cognition, cognitive linguistics, and lots of different areas, is say, hang on, René, you got it wrong. There is... it's not as split up as that. And if you want to visualize it better, it's more that the mind is nested within the body and the body within the whole environment or in the world. And that's really, in a sense, that captures the thesis that I'm going to talk to today. And here's a quote which captures that very well. Brains are in bodies, bodies are in the world, and meaningful action in these worlds is in large part socially constructed and conducted. And if you look at the words meaningful action and sort of unpack that, of course, we're talking here about language apart from anything else, first languages, second language, etc. The idea that Descartes had made a terrible mistake has been around since at least 1994, where this book came out, appropriately called Descartes' Error, by a cognitive neuroscientist, such a thing exists, called Antonio Damasio. And basically, he then, this is some time back now, tried to reconnect the mind and the body by saying that they work, as it were, in parallel or as an ensemble, and they interact with the environment. And that kind of interaction, if you like, is what we call mind. Mind is the body and the brain working as a function of the interaction with the environment in which they are embedded. This, of course, contrasts very much with the prevailing view within our field in second language acquisition, and the view that's the kind of the current orthodoxy, if you like, and has been around for a long time, that that language and language learning are a purely cognitive phenomenon. It's captured neatly in this quote by Michael Long and Jack Richards, an introduction to a huge book on cognition and second language instruction. They say second language acquisition is first and foremost a mental process. Cognition and cognitive factors, therefore, are central to any account of how and why SLA works or so often fails. And so, in other words, it's all happening in here. And to understand second language acquisition, you need look no further than the research into cognition and into the mind. And so all factors like identity, the social context, the environment, etc., they kind of impact on that, but they're not really considered relevant. And that you can predict the course of second language acquisition almost irrespective of where somebody is and what social context, etc. I mean, that's being a little bit extreme. But it's a view that as I say, it's not just specific to our field. It's the current cognitive paradigm, if you like. It's captured quite well by Steven Pinker, who said something to the effect that the mind was or the brain was the onboard computer in a robot made of tissue. So this is the robot made of tissue, and we carry around this little, so very, again, Cartesian distinction between mind and body. So what I want to do is look at an alternative kind of model, as to say this, the model in which these things are embedded, if you like, within each other. And I want to do it from the perspective of three different concepts: the notion of embodied mind, the notion of embedded mind, and the notion of extended mind. And I'll try and kind of like tease out those distinctions. And finally, I just wanted also, as a kind of coda to that, look at the concept of alignment. And as I say, I'll try and draw connections with our own field as we go along. So let's take embodied mind. Let's start with a text. This text happens to be about English language teaching, but it's not what I'm talking about today. It's just taken almost at random from a newspaper article, an interview with somebody who'd written a book about English as a global language. And I happened to be reading this, and I noticed straight off that there are a couple of metaphors embedded in this text. And one of you can spot them. I mean, when I say metaphors, I'm not talking about Shakespearean metaphors. I'm not talking about lit crit here. I'm talking about ways of construing the world in ways that are sort of metaphorical. They're not really literal. And I think you can see in the first sentence there this notion of English being on the up. English is on the up at the moment. And the other one is world history is full of languages. Now, both of those metaphors are kind of physical metaphors. They relate to the way that we experience our own physicality, both in terms of the vertical, horizontal axis and also in terms of containers. History can't really be full, only in a metaphorical sense, because history is not a container. Similarly, what does it mean that English is on the up? Is that a negative thing or is that a positive thing? Well, clearly it's a positive thing. It has associations of improvement, of getting better, of increasing, etc. Now, where does that metaphor come from? There's nothing intrinsically good about something being up as opposed to something being down. So where does it come from? Well, the argument by cognitive scientists and cognitive linguists is that it comes from our own experience of our physical embodiment. We, from birth, experience the verticality versus horizontality, is such a word, and also the notions of containership. And so we've got all these expressions associated with upness, and these are kind of language universals. You won't find many languages around the world which don't think of up as being something good, something increasing, something getting better. And similarly, the notion of containment is used metaphorically in such a way that we don't even think about it, that we're thinking about something like a walk being a container, or summer being a container, or a mind being a container. We take these notions on board because we've kind of grown up with them, and we can understand the world better because we've got these images which relate to our own physicality, what one writer calls image schemata. Similarly, our notion of the past and the future tends to be very much configured according to our own sense of motion through space. So we think of the future as ahead of us, and we have various linguistic ways of talking about that, or the past as being behind us. But why? I mean, again, there's no sort of logical reason to this. It's simply to do with how we interpret difficult concepts through physical experience and use metaphors to construe those concepts. So this is something that the basis, a fundamental proposition of cognitive linguistics, that language is rooted in the human experience of the physical world. This is another quotation from another Mark Johnson, who you might know of, who wrote, along with George Lakoff, the book Metaphors We Live By, way back in the, whatever it was, the 70s or 80s. This book I actually came across in a secondhand bookstall on the Upper West Side about 4 years ago. And this was the germ, if you like, of this kind of, this path of discovery. I read this book and I thought, wow, and it's not about language so much, it's about cognition. But he was making that exact argument, that all our experiences of the world and the way that we construe them in language are these, what he calls image schemata. They relate to our experience of our own physicality. So I was kind of intrigued by this, and I was intrigued how it might relate to language, and to second language in particular. Of course, he wasn't the first by any means to in a sense, articulate this idea, going way back to the early 19th century, well, the mid-19th century. Malinowski, the anthropologist, was working in the South Sea, or the South Pacific, made a similar kind of discovery, looking at the language and the way it was used functionally in its context of use. And he said, ultimately, all the meaning of all words is derived from bodily experience. So it's an old idea, and I'll put it on hold here for a moment, but when you think about how we learn language in our first languages and how it's so related to our own physicality, particularly looking at children, how they use their bodies when practicing chants and rhymes, etc. Here's a, do you know the Incy Wincy Spider? Oh, you do? Wow, God, I'm impressed. Well, you can sing along. This is a little kid. This is in Gujarati. Now English.
Down get the head, push it right around. Up get the head, ladder into the squares, get up over the bed.
So, because we know this, that this is language is mapped onto action and it's learnt through action, but people have been researching this more recently, have pursued the idea that if cognition is embodied, then learning is embodied, learning, more formal learning, and I'm going to take it to the next extent, which is if language is embodied, then language learning is embodied. Now, some of the research that's been done on other subjects other than language has been very suggestive. This was from a BBC website recently, and it was reporting a study that's been done showing that teaching of math using abstract gestures is a good way to help children to learn. And in fact, the researcher who they're quoting here has got a long tradition of doing studies into the learning of math here in the States. Well, two researchers, Susan Wagner Cook, who, for example, in 2007, she reported that third graders who were asked to gesture while learning algebra were nearly 3 times more likely to remember what they'd learned than classmates who did not gesture. So doing the kind of gesture that's illustrated here, just kind of connecting things that otherwise would not be, concepts which would not be easily grasped necessarily without some kind of physical mnemonic, if you like. And then in 2009, Golden Meadow, and I think this is it's the same researcher that's illustrated here, demonstrated that 4th graders learning how to solve a math equation identified the correct answers more often when they imitated a helpful gesture shown to them by an adult than when they were simply repeated the grown-up's words. So there's kind of suggestive stuff coming through from other disciplines, and this has been followed up in our own field in the learning of language. Seth Lindstromberg and Frank Boers have done a number of studies, relatively small-scale studies, but kind of exciting, on the learning of vocabulary, based on the proposition that in first language learning, acting out word meanings helps school-age children to increase their L1 vocabulary. So let's extrapolate now into L2 learning. How could you do that? And what they did, fairly obviously, one of their studies was what's called manner of motion verbs. A manner of motion verbs are verbs of different ways of walking, like staggering, trotting, running, marching, limping, etc. And they found that the retention was much better when these words were enacted, which kind of stands to reason. But what was interesting was that the retention of those who were watching other people acting out the words was also just as good. So in other words, you don't have to do it yourself, but you need to see it enacted. And then they did some more research onto phrasal verbs, you know, the famous phrasal verbs like roll over and stand up and fall over, that sort of thing. And they found again that the retention was much better when the learners enacted the directional movement of the particle of the phrasal verb. And not only that, they also, like, take a verb like get over, as in he got over the wall, they were able to abstract the meaning into its more idiomatic senses of he got over his illness, simply through having enacted these verbs in the classroom. So we've got something kind of going on here, I think, which is parallels to what was being studied in other subjects like math. And I read recently, a researcher who works in Hong Kong called Randall Holm in cognitive linguistics, and he was suggesting that having learners enact through gesture the difference between different kind of preposition. So his example for a cup of coffee would be a gesture like this. It's a kind of a mnemonic, if you like. Then a cup for coffee would be a gesture like that. To kind of physically realize some of these very elusive relationships, which are often realized by rather opaque prepositions. So you could do the same then with a friend of Kim's or a friend for Kim. Taking this a little bit further into more conventional drink, we've got the difference here again with phrasal verbs where if the students, I'm suggesting, enacted drink it, but drink it up, yeah, to give the sense of completion. Or similarly, write it and write it down, and it's getting these meanings, these extra meanings that are encoded in these particles, which is kind of would seem to lend itself to this approach. But I think also that different aspects of verbs, that trying to how could we physically realize the difference between something like I love it as a kind of a single state, if it's like, as opposed to something which captures the kind of ongoing dynamic notion of the progressive, as in I'm loving it, or he works a lot, he's working a lot, whatever. It will rain, it's going to rain. I did this in Japan. I was giving this talk to a group of teachers in Japan, and my suggestion for it will rain will be some kind of detached from the present point, whereas it's going to rain, it's a kind of like, it's moving towards the rain. And this Japanese teacher of English, who'd been teaching English for years, she came up to me after the talk and she said, that's the first time I've actually understood the difference. So I thought, I went to China. I mean, teachers, even when they're not teaching, do this every time they use the past tense. Yeah. Yesterday I went to, but it's more difficult to capture the more elusive notion of the retrospectiveness, if you like, of the present perfect. My attempt to do that was to do something like the kind of over-the-shoulder gaze, as I'm looking back at my experience, but it's sort of like still accessible. I was giving this talk, in fact, Caitlin was there. I was giving this talk in Japan, in France, a couple of years ago, and after the talk, one of the teachers who are attending said, this is absolutely amazing. Her professor at the University of Bordeaux has actually written a whole grammar based on these kinds of gestures. And not only that, it comes with an accompanying DVD. And his name is Jean-Remy Lapierre. And he's a cognitive linguist, but he's also a teacher and a wonderful speaker. If you get a chance to look at any of his YouTube videos with impeccable English. And this is the book he produced with its accompanying DVD, which is all in French, apart from the bits that are in English. But so if you don't speak French, it's a bit, but I'll give you a flavor of, this is his way of realizing the will versus going to distinction. And this is from a YouTube video. And this is how he describes the difference himself. And then you'll see how it's realized with professional actors. And I mean, as I say, it's in French, but you'll get the gist of it simply because it's so well realized physically.
Be going to.
Will.
Dans be going to, il y a going to, qui veut dire aller vers. On se dirige déjà vers l'événement. It's going to rain. He's going to cry. Pour la personne qui parle, c'est évident. Tout est en place pour que ça se fasse. Le présent mène droit au futur.
Will fait surgir l'image du futur. C'est net, c'est sûr. On prédit. You'll love it. On garantit. I'll be there.
Okay, so you get the idea. And as I say, he uses professional actors, and it's very effective, and he covers everything. I mean, he covers the definite article using mime. I mean, it's quite an amazing feat. But it's one I can't show it to you because it's not on the YouTube, but his present perfect is, again, it's beautiful to see, because it's the actor kind of reaches into his past. So for example, the example is, for example, I've been to China, and he reaches into his past. So that for the question, have you been to China, he reaches into his past, and he pulls out the experiences from the past, and he holds them in his hand and says, I have been to China. And if he hasn't, he reaches his past, in his past, and he pulls out, and his hands are empty. And it's absolutely beautiful to watch. And it seems to me I can't think of a better way of short-cutting, all that verbiage associated with aspect and indefinite past time and experiential this and hoo-ha, and no, forget it, just do that. Reach into the past, bring it out and hold it in your hands. And you have it. I've got the experiences. That's why we use have as the auxiliary. So this is Jean-Rémy Lapère, as I say. It's a pity, in a sense, that it hasn't been translated into English and is not more available, because it seems to me extremely exciting that somebody's gone to this amount of trouble. And to use acting and theater as the kind of, as the means of propagating these ideas. I was talking to a friend of mine a few years ago when I was planning this talk, and he's an actor, well, he's a theater director and dramaturg, etc., and I've known him for years, and he said, I was kind of describing, he's a non-specialist, and I said, what I was doing, and he said, oh, that's amazing. This sounds exactly like his mime teacher, and he'd studied mime under one of the leading French mimes, not Marcel Marceau, but in that kind of lineage, a guy called Jacques Lecoq. And Lecoq is, in his book, says, for in truth, nature is our first language, our bodies remember. And this was a central precept in his teaching of mime, the way that the body remembers, and you need to train it to remember and draw on its memory power as an actor, or a dancer for that matter. So this is the exciting thing about this field, really, that it draws on so many different disciplines, and it doesn't stop it. But of course, when you think about it, what is the thing that in language teaching is the most physical, or in language use is the most physical? And it's pronunciation. The way that we actually, it's the one thing that we do, apart from writing, which involves motor skills. And I was talking to Adrian Underhill, who some of you may know, who's written a lot about pronunciation, spoken about it. And Adrian, in fact, is responsible for the famous phonemic chart that you'll find in lots of classroom walls. And Adrian said this: pronunciation asks for physical learning and teaching style, a kinesthetically insightful practice. It must help students to connect with the muscles that make the difference. And just to give you a taste, this is from a video that Adrian did for Macmillan, his publisher, where he's demonstrating his use of the phonemic chart, among other things. But he situates it very firmly in this notion of the physicality, the kinesthetic nature of pronunciation teaching. Approach.
The idea is to take pronunciation out of the head and into the body. That's the first thing. To make pronunciation a physical activity, not just a mental activity. So that's number one. And I have a kind of thought that one of the problems with teaching pronunciation is that we keep it as a mental activity. Indeed, at universities, phonology courses are often taught as mental activities. So take pronunciation out of the head into the body. This means that we are using the muscles. We're making it a physical activity and focusing on the muscles. So one of my aims, and you will see this right at the beginning of the lesson, is to make a connection between the head and the muscles, to find where the muscles are.
And you can watch the rest of that video as he demonstrates exactly that. And then sort of coincidentally, again, I was at the TESOL conference convention a couple of years ago when it was in Dallas, I think, and I went to a workshop run by Bill Acton. Anybody heard of Bill? And he does very similar things, what he calls haptics. Haptic meaning touch, and it's actually physically feeling the motor, not only feeling them, but sort of enacting them again through gestures, etc. The the physicality of pronunciation. So again, I throw that out. It's all part of the same rich tapestry. Let's move on, though. I've talked about embodied mind. I want to talk about embedded mind now, the way that the mind, this mind-body continuum, if you like, is embedded in its physical context and the environment within it. The late lamented Leo van Leer was describing, using as an analogy for the way that language develops, describing the way that kids playing soccer kind of teach each other the rules of the game, or they discover the rules of the game through activity. And he writes that initially it's not about being told the rules of the game. It's certainly not about being lectured about them. They learn by participating in certain practices. And these practices include watching football games, but also hearing other people, like adults, talking about football, and then, of course, playing it. But what happens when you watch children learning to play football is that there's kind of the rules emerge. First of all, it's a kind of mad, just kicking the ball in every direction. Then gradually, a kind of strategy emerges. It's very much an emergent phenomenon. And he goes on to say the rules of the game become learnable in an interaction between bottom-up discovery and top-down instruction within the social context of playing the game. And this captures, to me, I think, something of this embeddedness of cognition, that it's always embedded in social activity, and particularly language. And this is why Leo van Leer uses the analogy of football, soccer, for how language, both in first language and second language, emerges through social activity. Now, a really, really powerful demonstration of this was done, you may be familiar with this TED talk, by an investigator mainly into artificial intelligence called Deb Roy at MIT. Now, what Roy was interested in was tracking the birth of language, first language, from the very moment when the first sounds are uttered. But we've had very little data on this because it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, because basically you would have to film and record a child from the moment, not when they first start using language necessarily, but before that, to watch this kind of evolutionary, this emergent process. So how would you do that? And then, of course, you've got to transcribe it all. But if you've got the resources, which Deb Roy has at MIT, then you wire up your home, every room of it, with video cameras in the ceiling, catching every single sound and image during the waking day. And then, of course, all you need is a child, which he arranged. And this is him talking about, this is an excerpt from the TED talk called The Birth of a Word, where he shows how this extraordinary elaborate technological structure captures the emergence of some of this child's first words.
That's looking at the speech context. What about the visual context? We're now looking at, think of this as a dollhouse cutaway of our house. We've taken those circular fisheye lens cameras and we've done some optical correction, and then we can bring it into three-dimensional life. So welcome to my home. This is one moment captured across multiple cameras. The reason we did this is to create the ultimate memory machine, where you can go back and interactively fly around and then breathe video life into this system. What I'm going to do is give you an accelerated view of 30 minutes, again, of just life in the living room. That's me and my son on the floor. And there's video analytics that are tracking our movements. My son is leaving red ink, I'm leaving green ink. We're now on the couch looking out through the window at cars passing by, and finally my son playing in a walking toy by himself. Now we freeze the action, 30 minutes. We turn time into the vertical axis, and we open up for a view of these interaction traces we've just left behind. And we see these amazing structures. These little knots of two colors of thread we call social hotspots. The spiral thread we call a solo hotspot. And we think that these affect the way language is learned. What we'd like to do is start understanding the interaction between these patterns and the language that my son is exposed to see if we can predict how the structure of when words are heard affects when they're learned. So in other words, the relationship between words and what they're about in the world. So here's how we're approaching this. In this video, again, my son is being traced out. He's leaving red ink behind, and there's our nanny by the door.
You want water? All right.
She offers water, and off go the two worms over to the kitchen to get water. And what we've done is use the word water to tag that moment, that bit of activity. And now we take the power of data and take every time my son ever heard the word water and the context he saw it in, and we use it to penetrate through the video and find every activity trace that co-occurred with the instance of water. And what this data leaves in its wake is a landscape. We call these wordscapes. This is the wordscape for the word water. And you can see most of the action is in the kitchen. That's where those big peaks are over to the left. And just for contrast, we can do this with any word. We can take the word bye, as in goodbye, and we're now zoomed in over the entrance to the house, and we look and we find, as you'd expect, a contrast in the landscape where the word bye occurs much more in a structured way. So we're using these structures to start predicting the order of language acquisition, and that's sort of ongoing work now.
Pretty amazing, eh? All that science just to predict that, or just to show that the word water is used more often in the kitchen than... Nevertheless, I think it's a very powerful representation, if you like, of how language is embedded in its contexts of use, and how cognition and learning are embedded in their contexts of use. And it argues for the fact that if we can recreate those kinds of circumstances in classrooms, that would be really powerful. But also, it suggests that research needs to be done with fisheye lenses in this classroom as to how these learning affordances are being created and used in actual classrooms, which is, after all, where most people learn languages in our context, in our experience anyway. So on the subject of language, then, people who are interested in the kind of science, in a sense, that you've just seen there, the notion of language as being a dynamic, emergent system. People who write about that now within our own field, applied linguists like Diane Larson-Freeman, have noted the point that language is developed in context, as we just saw there. Language is applied in context, and language is adapted in context. And that adaptation is something that we experience on a daily basis as we switch our language, our code, our register, our style, if you like, according to who we're talking to. We do this with accents, we do this with choice of vocabulary, we do this with complete strangers. This is an example from a shopping conversation, an authentic dialogue in a shop between an assistant in the UK. Assistant says, probably needs adjusting, but I'll check that. Oh, right, that's lovely. Assistant says, okay, yeah, that's nice. They're nice, aren't they? Yeah, they are nice. Very, very nice. Notice how they pick up, and they're echoing each other just on that simple word. They could have said all sorts of things, and they could have contrasted it and said, but no, nice, 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 which creates this kind of empathy. And this, some people have suggested, is this accommodation that we do with language is an effect of the mirror neurons that we're kind of hardwired with, a theory that is highly controversial. But the writer of this book on mirror neurons says, during conversations, we imitate each other's expressions, even each other's syntactic constructions. If one person engaged in a dialogue uses the word sofa rather than the word couch, the other person engaged in the dialogue will do the same. So this is, again, an example of how language is adapted to the context in which it is used. And we see that not just, of course, in language, but we see it in body language as well, classically in the way that we kind of reflect. If two people are at a cafe and one's got their legs crossed, the other person's bound to have their legs crossed as well. And you can find this kind of stuff all over the internet. Okay, so that's how we've looked at how the mind is embodied, that it kind of captures the structures or our experience of the world, our physical experience of the world, and that the mind is embedded in its context of use. And now I want to look at a third notion, that the mind extends beyond the body. And this, to capture that, I'm using a still from a film. I don't know, does anybody recognize it? Memento, exactly. So this is the story, a thriller, about a guy played by Guy Pearce, who has witnessed a murder, and he's the chief suspect, but he's also lost his memory, or he's lost most of it. So the only way he can retain traces of the memory of this original, am I getting it right? Is that he tattoos his experiences onto his body. So by the end, his body is covered in tattoos, which he can then refer to. So to me, it captures graphically the notion that we use our bodies to remember. The body remembers. And of course, we do this regularly on a daily basis. Think of it, you don't have to write down your shopping list, but it often helps if you've kind of recorded it on your, I mean, I do this, I'm counting, how many more assignments do I have to grade this weekend? Well, I've done Virginia's, I've done Carol's, I've done, so I go through and I can, so that helps me remember. We do this constantly using our bodies in a sense as an extension of our minds. The experience of going to the ATM and keying in your 4-digit number is almost, it's better if you don't try and remember the number and just let your fingers do the walking. And people who learn any kind of musical instruments will attest to this. In fact, ironically, there's a passage in Descartes where he talks about how lutenists, when they play the lute, have to forget. They have to separate, they have to, in a sense, fuse the mind and the body again, because it's only the body that can remember the actual frets and notes, etc. And anybody who's ever learnt, apparently I'm told, to write calligraphy like kanji script in Japanese, in this case, is it, Christopher? Am I right? Apparently it says ninja, but I live in trepidation. When I do this talk in Japan, it says something obscene. It's like, tattoos can often get horribly wrong. But people who have said, attest to the fact that the best calligraphers are the ones who let their hand do the drawing, the painting, that you can't think your way through these kinds of things. So these are good examples of the way that the mind extends beyond the body, as in this graphic, this painting by Salvador Dali, which is the cover of a book by a leading researcher in this field. And what he looks at are lots of different implications of this, but the one that particularly I'm interested in, because it so relates to language use, is gesture. And Clark writes that gesture continuously informs and alters verbal thinking, which is in turn continuously informed and altered by gesture. The two form a genuinely coupled system. Now, we tend to think of gesture as something we kind of add on to. We overlay speech with as a kind of decoration, if you like. But in fact, all the studies that have been done of gesture show that, in fact, gesture and speech are what's called co-expressive. You cannot separate them out. They happen, and they seem to come from the same parts of the brain, if you like, that if the language area of the brain is affected, then gestures, if the language area of the hand is affected, if the brain area of the hand is affected, then language is also affected. As I say, it seems not to have anything to do necessarily with making us more communicative. People gesture when people can't see them. Haven't you seen that, where people on their cell phones are gesturing wildly? People gesture in the dark. Blind people gesture to each other even when they know the other person's blind. They still gesture. So gesture seems to be intrinsic in our use of language. It's not, as I say, an decoration. It's like intonation in a sense. You cannot speak without intonation. And intonation really is a kind of vocal gesturing, and the two often work in conjunction. So gestures are components of speech, not accompaniments, but actually integral parts of it. So I just want to look at this area, and again, and sort of maybe think about how it relates to language learning and language use. First of all, I'm just going to show you a clip of with the sound off, of a person who's talking in English, but it's her second language. I just want you to watch her expressive use of gesture, and even maybe try and predict what she's talking about. Okay, here she is again now with...
In Spain, we have a tradition of eating 12 grapes in the last 12 seconds of the year. I don't know if people know about that here.
I've never heard about that, no. Yeah.
So we were going to a party in a boat, so I was carrying kilos of grapes all night to the boat, to the captain, and then we got in a little dinghy to go to a different boat.
I'm sorry, you got into a what?
No, dinghy, little boat. How do you call it?
Wait, let me hear that again. You got into a what?
No,
just one more time. Let me just one more time, please.
So many
get into a what? You get into a...
studying English
No,
and
it's fine.
I still get this.
No, please.
It's so sad.
I'm enjoying this. One more time, please.
A little boat to go from the big boat to another one. So we missed the time, and we spent
so you missed midnight.
The last seconds eating the grapes in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the sea, but it was really beautiful.
No, that sounds lovely. And the tradition of eating the grapes is, what is that? 12?
You ask for 12 wishes. You have to be very fast, one by second.
Yeah.
And you should try to get the smallest grapes so that you can go and live in the
Well, sure,
year.
small grapes, especially if you're riding in a small boat. Or what do they call those things, those small boats? What are they?
No, again. We can try to speak some Spanish if you want.
Well, no.
Okay, so again, I mean, you see, of course, she's an actress, but it is interesting that in her second language she's as expressive as she probably is in her first. And just looking at the gestures, or the work that's been done into gesture has been the kinds of gesture that have been identified basically fall into these four groups. It's what's called deictic gestures. These are the first ones we learn as a child, and the first ones we learn to recognize that that's simply pointing. And we seem to be, again, genetically hardwired to recognize pointing, understand what it means, whereas most other animals, I think, I've had this argument before. Dog owners always say that their dogs know what they're pointing at, but I suspect that they think they know what they're pointing at, but the dog is actually expecting you to throw something in that direction. That's why it's looking over there. But certainly the great apes don't know how to recognize pointing, and certainly dogs don't know how to point, even if they know how to recognize pointing. And then there's the things called beats. Beats are when you simply beat the rhythm of what you're saying to kind of emphasize what you're saying. Politicians do this all the time. You can see it on television. It's a way of adding some kind of conviction to what they're saying. So that is a beat. And then there are representational gestures, gestures which represent something. I'll come back to that again. And then there are pragmatic and interactional gestures, gestures which indicate, for example, that you've reached the end of your turn, or you don't understand something, gestures that have a particular communicative function, if you like. We tend to think, when we think of representational gestures, we tend to think of all this kind of work that people like Desmond Morris did in the 1970s, which is these kind of things that the Italians do this, and the Spanish do that, and the Brazilians do the other, and the Japanese, and you must be careful you don't do this in Brazil, and you don't do... This is kind of a very, very small area of gesture, and perhaps in a sense one of the least interesting. It's a bit like idioms in language, that we talk about things like a red herring, or, you know, a black sheep of the family, etc., and it's different in other languages. It's kind of mildly interesting for about 5 minutes, but I think in the end, it represents such a very small part of what we do when we gesture. These are things that what are called emblems, the gesture people, or sometimes called gesticulation or whatever. The emblems, and I found this book miraculously in an apartment I was staying at a couple of summers ago, and came out in the 70s, you can tell, and it's kind of fun because it looks at all the Spanish so-called gestures, the ones that are specifically Spanish. I'm kind of fond of these drawings apart from anything else. So you've got this scratching on the blackboard gesture, which is actually meant to be beckoning, and this is what's called kissing among women, not kissing between women anyway, but kissing among women. And then you've got things like attracting the waiter. And if you think about it, that is probably doing the kind of, you know, the bring me the bill. So you're drawing. I think it's absolutely wonderful that a whole book can be written about gesture and illustrated by somebody who can't draw hands. But as I say, this is in a sense the least of our interest, really. I mean, it's kind of, as I say, from a cultural point of view, there's a certain interest, but it's not what people do mostly when they gesture. They're not attracting the waiter, and they're not they're not indicating that they're speaking on the phone, for example. So when you look at Penelope Cruz here, you'll see that she's using representational gestures, but they're kind of universal. They're not specifically idiomatic. So when she says, I was carrying kilos of grapes, she does exactly that, and it's recognizable across languages. Or similarly, a little boat, she demonstrates that with her hands. Or a more metaphorical one, in the middle of nowhere. And then there's the pragmatic gestures that she uses, which are when she's kind of, asking help with the vocabulary item. Now, the work that's been done into second language use of gestures it's a very new field, but it's a very exciting one. And some of the things that they've found with learners is that gestures can actually enhance the learner's communicative competence. Now, why? Well, one reason is that they can help the beats in that to chunk information, to accompany the spoken message and to kind of help as a form of intonation, if you like, or rhythm, adding emphasis to key information. They can increase redundancy and reduce ambiguity by being representational. And they can manage turn-taking. They facilitate the kind of natural to and fro of conversation. They can also, and we tend to think of this maybe one of the first uses of gestures, where learners don't know the word for something, and so they'll gesture. So I don't know the word for corkscrew, for example, so I'll gesture. I mean, that is a useful communication strategy, but it's only useful for things that you can physically represent, which is a limited set of items. So it's actually not that much used, and it's usually used in accompaniment with some kind of verbal attempt to paraphrase. So you wouldn't say, you go into the shop and I say, I want one of those things. You'd say, I want one of those things that you pull corks out of bottles, kind of thing. So in other words, it's like all gesture, it tends to be accompany speech rather than be a substitute for speech. And another very important function of, and this is perhaps the most important function of gesture for language learners, is that it reduces the cognitive load. And it seems to be a fact that you gesture more in your second language than you do in your first language. Why? Because it sort of offloads cognitive effort. This is the idea. And in fact, it's something that's, it's entrenched in lots of different ways. You see actors memorizing their lines, and you'll see them kind of, or you'll see people, kids in the street preparing for their end of the year examinations, or in Quranic schools, the learning of the Quran, which is accompanied by bobbing. Now, this is all apparently because it helps offload cognition onto the body and allows the brain to concentrate on particular learning tasks. So this would seem to be very, very important if you're speaking another language, that you kind of need to also it buys you time. If you even if you run out of words, if you just carry on flapping your arms, nobody's going to interrupt you. And it can sort of make up for your feeling of being inexpressive by showing, well, I can't express myself very through language, but look at my arms. And finally, for demonstrating empathy, and maybe that's the same thing that and it seems to be a fact that you can convince people that you are fluent by gesturing and empathetic, as it were. It's very good advice if you've got people who are training to do any kind of speaking test, like in IELTS, for example, is to make sure that they remember to gesture while they're doing the test. Studies have been done of learners doing the same speaking task, one where they've been not allowed to gesture, another where they've done exactly the same task but they've been allowed to gesture, and they've always been rated better, more fluent, even though the task was exactly the same and their production of the language was exactly the same, but they were rated more fluently if they were seen to gesture. So, just to sum up then on gesture, gestures occupy a unique function in human behavior. They're bodily actions, but they're also cognitive actions, and they're very, again, a good example of how the mind extends into the body. We think with our hands, as the same writer said elsewhere. So I want to finally look at, because we're getting near the end, I want to look at this notion of alignment, not least because it's well represented in the Penelope Cruz interview, where remember, she pulls away from him when he starts teasing her about her English, which I've seen this video so many times, but I don't understand what her problem is. She says, what does she say? What's she meant to say? Dingy. Yeah. Whatever. They're obviously decided to kind of integrate it into the interview during the rehearsals, and so it's a kind of little joke. I mean, it's kind of cute, but I mean, I love it, the fact that she says, it's so sad, all these years studying English and I still get this. But notice how she physically pulls herself away. She disaligns, is that a verb, herself from Letterman, and she sort of twists her body and away from him to indicate lack of empathy, if you like, or resistance, etc. Now, the way that speakers align themselves with one another and the way that learners align themselves with one another has been an ongoing subject of research. This study was done by a group of researchers, and I quoted them way at the beginning when we talked about meaningful action. The same researchers. And this was a study, a small-scale study done of a Japanese girl doing her homework using a workbook, and her aunt, who's a fluent English speaker and a teacher, in fact, helping her with it. So it's a kind of a micro study of not just what they say, but how they align themselves to the task, both to each other and to the workbook. And it's one of the pioneering studies in this direction. And what one of the researchers says is that learning is more about discovering how to align with the world than extracting knowledge from it. We tend to think of learning as being extracting knowledge, but the idea of these so-called socio-cognitive researchers is that it's more about aligning to the speech community that you want to join. And so various studies, we're starting to see more and more of these in the literature, studying group work, eye contact, alignment, gesture, the whole caboodle. And this researcher says an understanding of what goes on in the interactions is best arrived at by close examination of the talk and embodied behavior of group work participants. We used to just study the talk. Hundreds and hundreds of ethnographic studies of talk in classrooms or between learners, transcribed lovingly, but without any reference to what they were actually doing physically or all their gestures. And the realizations coming through, we need to go back to the drawing board. We need to transcribe the gestures as well to really understand what's going on in terms of the learning opportunities that are taking place. I was very lucky to be involved in a study myself. Well, I didn't do the work, but Christine Jacknick, who some of you may know, she actually taught on the master's program here a few summers back, and she teaches at a community college here in Manhattan. And she had collected a vast body of data for her dissertation, and she shared it with me, and we wrote an article for this collection of papers in honor of Dick Schmidt. And one of the sequences in this that Christine gathered was a moment in a classroom where the teacher's been teaching the difference between to stop to do something and stop doing something. You know that one? So stop smoking versus I stopped smoking in 1956. I stopped to smoke after I'd been grading papers or whatever. And so this is the point. So one of the students, Nobu, has got it. And he kind of reports it back. So you've got the teacher here on the side. Nobu's saying, if you say, I stopped to smoke, means I stopped, and notice his gestures. He's using a kind of smoking gesture. I stopped and smoked, yeah? And Rod, who hasn't got it, but then watches this exchange, he says, in the first one you were walking, and he does the fingers were walking, and then you stopped, gesture showing stopped, and then you stopped to light, and then, now notice he's using exactly the same gestures as Nobu used. In other words, he's appropriating not just the language, but the gestures, and the gestures arguably are acting as some kind of scaffold with which he can make sense of this distinction which he hadn't quite realized. And this is all happening in seconds, but it was just captured in this moment, and beautifully illustrated by Pete Lute, who's in the audience. But it's the sort of thing that goes on, perhaps almost we're unconscious of it until we start to see it. And it's happening in this space, if you like, that the teacher's created with this pair. It's literally a zone of proximal development. I mean, that's a physical zone where this learning affordance is operating. So this is the kind of interesting stuff that relates to our own world. And now I just want to move on to looking finally at some of the implications of what I've been talking about. And I'll talk about four things very briefly. The notion of movement, the notion of enactment, of gesture, and also of posture. And the notion of movement, I think, is pretty kind of, we're aware of that classes really, really kind of get exciting and fun and things brighten up, and there's a degree of perceptible engagement when you get students up on their feet, apart from anything else, or you get them out in front of the class, or you get them milling around. So movement not only breaks up the lesson, but it probably also allows people to use language in a much more natural way, to be able to gesture and move around and do all the kinds of things which we're so socially well equipped to do. So acting out, and we've seen that already with the usefulness of acting out vocabulary like phrasal verbs, verbs of motion, etc. But maybe going one step further into acting out particular concepts. The teacher's use of gesture, of course, is incredibly important here. And studies of teachers who gesture shows that the teachers who gesture tend to be able to create are more intelligible to their learners, particularly if these gestures are kind of consistent and the students recognize as part of the teacher's language, their body language as it were. But particular gestures can also be used to manage classes, and here are a few from a book on classroom management. We've seen how gesture can be used, could be used to capture particular, otherwise very elusive linguistic concepts. And this one kind of interests me. When I talked about posture, I read an article in the New York Times Sunday Supplement a few years ago about charter schools. And this particular charter school, the KIPP Academy, you may well have heard of, they have these rules. And this is up in every classroom. And the acronym is SLANT. And basically, this is what the students have to do. They have to sit up, because the idea is if you're slouched, you're less likely to be kind of attentive than if you're sitting up. You have to listen, you have to ask questions, and you have to nod. And this is kind of interesting one. This struck me as being, yeah, it's true actually. If people are nodding, even if they don't understand, they might convince themselves that they do understand. And I notice myself, I can't see you because it's too dark in here, but when I'm giving a talk and there's somebody who's nodding, I tend to direct all my attention eventually to that person because they agree with me. And then tracking the speaker with your eyes, the same thing. You're very aware when you're giving a talk, but also in the classroom, the students who are kind of like out to lunch, or looking at their watch, or texting, or otherwise not focused. So now the idea is that if the students are doing these things, they will, in a sense, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If they are nodding and tracking the teacher and are sitting up, they will physically be compelled to pay more attention, will they feel like they're understanding. Yet to be proved, but I think, again, I kind of like the idea. So, just to end on a kind of literary note, Eva Hoffman and her wonderful book, Lost in Translation, you must know this, but she was a Polish immigrant to the United States when she was a teenager, and she describes in this wonderful book, which long predates the film of the same title and has nothing to do with it, she talks about how she kind of grappled with English. And one of the things she found very discouraging was she wasn't allowed to, she was discouraged from being demonstrative because this was felt, it wasn't English, that's too European, you don't want to be like that. And she writes in this book, she says, my mother says I'm becoming English. This hurts me because I know she means I'm becoming cold. I'm no colder than I've ever been, but I'm learning to be less demonstrative. I learned this from a teacher who tells me to sit on my hands and then try talking. And you think, you can see that the teacher might have been motivated to try and help her with her English by getting her to gesture less, but it's such a counterproductive thing to do. It's like sort of, I don't know, shackling a runner or something. And so, but then the good news is that towards the end of the book, then she discovers she as it were, internalizes English, this whole spirit of English. And she writes graphically at the end, she says, now the language has entered my body, has incorporated itself in the softest tissue of my being. And that, again, seems to me to be a very graphic image of how language is embodied, how cognition is embodied, how learning is a process of embodiment. So, to go back to our friend René, I think it's not a case of I think, therefore I am. It's much more like I move, therefore I am. After all, that's what the definition of an animate being is. We're thinking animate means animate, coming from moving, animated. Yeah? So we are by definition mobile, moving, never more so. And there I speak, therefore I move. You cannot speak without moving, even if it's just moving your jaw, but it's all about movement. And I move, therefore I learn, and that's the kind of message that I want you to go away with. But if that's too difficult, then go back to another great 20th century philosopher, and that's Mae West, who said, I speak 2 languages, English and body. So, as I said, this was work in progress. I blogged about this topic after I read the book by Mark Johnson that I found on Upper Broadway. I blogged about it. Then I was invited to write a paper or a chapter for a book, which was a tribute to Earl Stevick, who some of you will know as being a great pioneer in our field, particularly of humanist learning psychology. And Earl Stevick, who regrettably passed away last year but was able to actually see this book, promoted the idea of holistic learning, of learning through not just the intellect, not just through cognition, but through the whole person, including their body. And he was a great promoter of holistic learning in a time where it was just becoming accepted across a number of disciplines, but in a sense it kind of faded away. And the beauty of this book was it gave me an opportunity to write a chapter called The Learning Body, which is really a summary of this talk as a tribute to his work in this field. And so those are the references. I will give you my website address in a minute, where you'll find a kind of the PDFs of this talk. So if you want to go back and look at the references or any of the other references, they are available. But in the meantime, I think we're really out of time. I'm going to finish now, and thank you again for your attention. And sorry that it wasn't less embodied. Thank you. But I think, it's customary to have a bit of time for questions. So anybody who does have a question before we adjourn to the cold drinks is welcome to place them. And there are microphones strategically positioned here for you to do so. But I don't think we need them, really. There's not enough people here. I can probably hear you. And so if anybody has anything to add, then please feel free. Yeah, Jackie.
Do all cultures see up as a good thing? First question. Secondly, what does the mirroring thing have to do with neuro-linguistic programming? Is that related in any way?
Okay, the up thing, I think you find is pretty universal. I wouldn't hand on heart say that it is, but it's very unlike, just as the forward thing in the future and the back thing in the past. But you'll find different cultures and different languages maybe slightly construe those in slightly different ways, but it seems to be fairly universal. So I would suggest the up and the down thing. After all, we grow up and we're very conscious as children. You see this with, you're constantly seeing this with people seeing children saying, oh, wow, how you've grown. And, with a big smile on your face, it's just clearly a good thing to be doing, is growing. And when people fall down, or if you see people falling down the street, and it's always, it's a negative thing, etc. So I think it's ingrained, and I would say it probably is, but I wouldn't swear by it. Now, your second question in relation to neuro-linguistic programming, I'm glad you brought that up, because I meant to say, with regard not just to neuro-linguistic programming, the idea, as I understand it, of neuro-linguistic programming is not dissimilar in that we are programmed to construe the reality in particular ways. And from a teaching point of view, if you can chime with the way that your learner is, in a sense, programmed, their particular style, then so much the better, which brings us into the area of learning styles. And I noticed, I sort of sensed when the word kinesthetic went up, when Adrian Underhill was talking about pronunciation, that some people may have been drawing connections between learning styles, classically the auditory, the visual, the kinesthetic, the whatever. And I would argue that no, I'm not talking about learning styles at all, actually. I'm saying that the kinesthetic learning style is the learning style. It's not like some people are more kinesthetic. No, we're all kinesthetic, and we need to, as teachers, we need to exploit that, just as we're all auditory and we're all verbal. So I don't I don't hold this idea of packaging people up into these kind of medieval humors like, phlegmatic and whatever. It's just, it seems to be, it's the same kind of, to me, it's the same false science as that alchemic theories of the way that the world is arranged. So kinesthetic, yes, but we're all kinesthetic. And what's other interesting thing is that people who are incapacitated in some particular motor skill or in some particular sense do tend to compensate through gesture. So, I've been asked this question before about signing, and I'm not going to get into signing because I don't know enough about it, but clearly there's an overlap here between language, signing, and gesture. But the interesting thing is, the question was asked, when people sign, do they gesture? And the fact is, the research is, yes, they do. That signing and gesture are two different systems, but signers gesture. So when they want to show kind of strong emotion, they'll do their signing with greater or lesser degree of emphasis, etc. So there's two systems operating there, both signing and gesture. And I think that's also very, very interesting. So yes, thank you, Jackie. Thank you for raising that. Yeah, way at the back.
What advice do you have for those of us who think of ourselves as clumsy or uncoordinated or not terribly at home in our bodies? You're not alone. I'd say apart from a few gifted dancers and mimes, etc., who are all pretty kind of uncoordinated. So I wouldn't worry about that. I don't think it's, what I'm not suggesting is that we have to be brilliant mimes and beautiful movers in the classroom, not at all. I think it is important that we project ourselves physically through and not be ashamed of gesturing, and maybe do it a little bit more than we normally would as I said, you can tell the experienced teacher because they can't stop doing this if you're trying to talk about the past. Or they start decontracting with their fingers, I wasn't. So I'm not saying you have to be a dancer, you have to be a mime, you have to be beautifully elegant in that, but I do say that I think you should be aware that just with voice we need to project, we also need to project with our bodies, and we shouldn't be ashamed of doing that. Any other questions or comments? Caitlin?
So most of the examples were speaking, gesture,
Mm-hmm.
writing is also gesture.
It is, indeed.
So, and I'm wondering, there's studies about in writing you retain it better, so what do we do in the classroom or respond to that?
Yeah.
Helping students to learn,
Yeah.
including tablets.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, and I don't know enough about this, but there have been some sort of stuff comes through from time to time, studies of learning through by writing and copying and handwriting, and the value of handwriting, and how some schools systems are resisting giving up teaching handwriting because they realize that in fact so much learning happens and so much ownership happens when you actually handwrite a text rather than key it in. So this is, I have no answers to that, but it's a very, very interesting notion, and it would be perfectly consistent with the notion that just as we're looking at calligraphy, that you learn calligraphy through letting your hand do the painting, then let your hand do the writing perhaps, rather than the mind all the time. So I think those of us who were brought up as writers, handwriters, perhaps somewhat regret the transition, although it's made things a lot easier, but we see it in other generations coming through that may have lost a capacity, which in fact is incredibly important in terms of cognition and learning. But again, I don't know enough about it. Anything else? Nobody's asked me. Yeah, okay, in the middle.
Maybe up there's gesturing.
Mm-hmm.
Especially for present perfect. It's fine that you can sort of demonstrate it, but what about the usage between, because the usage is completely different in French and in English, the use of the tense. So how is...
Well, now he's doing it from an English perspective. He is actually bilingual himself in English and French. So his grammar is based on the English concepts of the tenses, etc. It may be in some ways influenced by his unique perspective from being a bilingual. But I think I haven't watched the DVD from all of his things, but it is quite impressive how he captures, like for example the articles again, how he captures these distinctions, the English distinctions, which are quite different from the French distinctions, and he somehow captures these. So he is actually a trained cognitive linguist. He is He studied cognitive linguistics exhaustively. You get that from reading his book. So I kind of, but what the beauty of it is he's also obviously a very good language teacher, and he's also interested in theater and movement. And so bringing all these different disciplines together, he's created something which I think is actually quite amazing and original. And as I say, it's a great pity that it's not more accessible to non-French speakers. There was another question. Yeah. Paula. Yes.
I don't know if you can help me. I think that learn language with body is easier for children.
Uh-huh.
Now I teach adults.
Mm-hmm.
They don't like moving their body. They think that they have to learn the language in their
head. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, the question was, is it easier for children? Clearly it's easier for children, and anybody here who teaches children will know that you cannot teach children without involving movement and action and activity, games, etc. It is sad that so many of these natural language learning faculties are kind of pushed under, as it were. I don't think they're irretrievably lost, but as we move into adulthood, we become a little bit that's an effect partly of our education system that prioritizes mental learning as opposed to whole body learning. And I don't think you have to take that into account. I remember I used to do quite a lot of total physical response in my classes. Remember TPR? I mean, those of you, again, it's a great thing to do with kids, but you're just giving them instructions and acting them out as a kind of Simon Says methodology. And I did this with adults, beginners, particularly when I was teaching in Spain. And I remember doing it with a group of adults. We were doing prepositions or something, and they were having to and a woman just got up and walked out, and she never came back. You know, and I just assumed that she felt she was being infantilized. So it's a very good point. I mean, you have to be very, very cautious of doing any of these kind of wacky things that ride roughshod over students' expectations. So maybe you need to demystify them by telling them that, you know, but there's a body of research which suggests that you can learn phrasal verbs, for example, by actually gesturing rather than just simply writing them down and trying to remember them. But no, it's a very good point. Yes?
Talking about pronunciation
Uh-huh.
and the teaching of it, I always tell my students whenever I'm talking about pronunciations that it's like playing two different sports. So you've been, for example, you've been speaking your first language all your life, and now you're switching to another one, and the muscles are used differently, and different muscles are used. And so as if you've been playing golf all your life, and now you have to switch to tennis. But as somebody I've studied a lot of dance as an adult, I know that it involves a lot of repetition, repetition of movement. And when I think about, you know, doing repetition for pronunciation, I just feel like that's a really surefire way of frustrating a class. So.
Well, this is another one of these learning faculties that we lost as we moved into adulthood, because as kids we never got bored with repeating things, like Incy Wincy Spider. So yeah, how do you kind of like, and I think just going back to what you said, it's absolutely true that pronunciation from one language to another, it's not just a question of learning a new set of phonemes or a new set of, it's a whole, you've got to move the whole apparatus around. You've got to adjust it. And one way of getting people to do that, to think about it, is to get them to speak their own language, their first language, with an English accent. And they know how to do that because they've seen it in movies all the time, the gringo accent. So just speak Spanish, if you're a Spanish speaker, speak it as if you were an English person. And then say, now what's happened? What did you do to your mouth to sound like a gringo? And another thing you can do is have them if you can collect a number of video clips of people who are not famous, so nobody knows who they are, speaking French or Spanish, and including an English speaker, turn the sound off and get them just to look at the face and say, now, what language is that person speaking? And it's amazing what you can pick up on. You can tell an American from a French, from a Russian, et cetera. So, but you've got to hide all the other clues that would give the game away. But yeah, you're absolutely right. But coming back to the question of repetition, then, I mean, it's like all pronunciation teaching. I think there's certain students will be motivated to do it, and you need to give them the tools and the means to do that outside the classroom. And this is why, you know, language laboratories, one of the things they were very good at. You know, they give people endless practice time and feedback. So, but I mean, in the classroom, difficult, but well intended. Okay, yeah, in the middle.
The question is, for some of these techniques, how do they work with more advanced students? Because this is sort of what someone else has alluded to. I mean, I just thought that the I will and I'm going to is brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I can pull that off with my students, which is sort of, oh, come on, teacher. You know what? I think you have to have a certain courage and flamboyance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and I think it comes back, it's related to this thing about kids versus adults and beginner students versus advanced, etc. I think we have to be very cautious about doing things that will insult the intelligence or the expectations of learners. And maybe it is an area that is more relevant to people coming into the language for the first time, and that maybe at the higher end that perhaps these the implications of this or getting students up and moving, etc., is less important. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. For me, it's a kind of new area, and I haven't had a chance to kind of try it out on a variety of learners. And I think, though, I think one of the things that, for me, is salient in the research is looking now at how groups of students work amongst themselves and how they kind of teach each other. And that little example we saw of Rob and Nobu and how they kind of co-constructed that learning moment. I think, if nothing else, we can't teach them how to do that, but we can see it happening. And I think I've become, myself as a teacher trainer, much more observant to what's going on in groups and in pairs and detecting when learning is failing. And that it's time to stop as opposed to realizing, wow, there's something really happening here. There's kind of, there's peer teaching going on. So I think maybe that's the area that we need to concentrate on at higher levels. So shared writing. Another study, one of these other studies that was done in Japan was a pair doing a translation activity. And it just focused on the way that they were kind of aligned and misaligned at various stages and how they used the resources in the dictionary and the laptop, etc. And I mean, maybe it doesn't help us as teachers, but the research is suggesting there's a lot more is going on than we give students credit for often. And so it's being alert to those kind of factors. That
yeah, it's a very dynamic way of teaching. I would hope that you could extend it to the higher level.
Exactly. And it also...
people sit in their
yeah. No, it validates the use of pair and group work apart from anything else. Yeah. Any other comments before we adjourn? Cliff, you've been very quiet.
Yeah, no, this last little bit has brought up to me what we were discussing in our online class about, perhaps the use of this in upper levels is in pragmatics.
Mm-hmm.
That, how, I don't want to sound like the guy from the 70s. This is how Italians gesture, this is how we gesture in Japan. No, not like that. But literally in this city, gesture is used very differently in certain parts of Brooklyn. Very local pragmatism. And also we have to be careful about what is the destination of the student. Where does the student live and how do they want to function? But I think that's an area where we really, especially if we're in a local context that we're quite familiar with, the nominative New Yorker, for example, we can really help them with,
Yeah, I think we should, we shouldn't be afraid. I mean, making them aware that language happens always with other contextual factors, including other physical factors, can only be good, interesting for them, and it makes kind of people watching much more interesting too. I mean, literally, it's people watching. They have to understand what people are saying to be able to kind of work out what their relationship is, etc. So, being sensitive to those factors can only be a good thing, particularly for students who are planning to some degree to integrate into this target culture. Absolutely. And there was one more question. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if, because the physical involvement is so effective, I teach mostly lower levels, and it's great. I'm wondering if it could be used, though, in intermediate and upper levels as some kind of a facilitator for breaking through fossilization, because that's such a problem. And I wonder if somehow the physical could be used to...
ways, that's an interesting idea. I mean, the proposition is that it might help with fossilization at higher levels, that some kind of physicality or something. And of those of you who were here last year when I talked about fossilization and my own experiences of trying to defossilize my Spanish, will remember that one of the key learning experience for me was the kind of face-to-face exchanges I had with a friend in Spanish over a glass or two or three of red wine in a bar. Now, to what extent, I wouldn't say that it was physical, but it was embodied and it was embedded. And it was this thing, I don't want to run away with this idea because in a sense it's not good news, but in a sense so much language learning does happen outside of classrooms. And some of the best language learning happens outside of classrooms. And how can we kind of, what can we import into classrooms to recreate those things? Because I think you're absolutely right. I think the only way that we're going to kickstart learners who are fossilized is to take them out into the world and be using their language in ways that really matter to them much more than they do in the classroom, or bring the outside world into the classroom somehow. So I think, this is the great thing about the communicative approach. This is what it introduced into our pedagogy many years ago, the idea of using language for its communicative purposes, through role plays and discussions and conversations. But we've kind of got sidetracked, nevertheless, through an obsession with, the traditional things that language learning has always been obsessed with, grammar and vocabulary, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you're absolutely right. I think you're onto something that we think there could be a relationship between context and fossilization at least, and we need to think about that. Okay, nobody's asked the question, I thought you might ask, which is, well, what does this mean for those of us who teach English or languages online, where there isn't this kind of sense of physicality and embodiment? I think that's another interesting kind of corollary to what you've just suggested. It is, are we missing something through not having that kind of physical, the physicality of the experience with the other learners and with the teacher? And those of you who have taught online or have been taught online will know that in a sense it's always perhaps second best, that you're actually compensating for the fact of this immediate physicality. And Judy, I'll take your question and that'll be it. Or comment.
The online teaching, I think that's one of the greatest things that now we are moving online teaching is Skyping and Google Plus, and not just verbal or written, but a visual. I've been doing a lot of collaboration with
well, that's certainly a step in the right direction. Yeah.
It's kind of exciting because one of the teachers I work with, she teaches English drama in Croatia, and her students, when they talk with me, there's a whole physical thing going on with it.
But this also suggests, actually, a piece of advice that suddenly occurs to me, that if you're if you're teaching online through Skype or you're giving a webinar, make sure the camera is positioned in such a way that it's not just your head. So you can see the full Monty, because that's what it's all at. It's in the hands. Just as
It makes a big difference in
absolutely. We're talking of communication. I think it's time we adjourn and communicate it in an embedded context over some drinks. So thank you again for your time and thank you for your comments.